Hi, everybody. My name is Logan Sears. I'm technical product manager over at Brandfolder. That just means I was an engineer, and then we had too many engineers, and we needed to put another level in there. And that was me. Now I get to do middle level management, and my dream has come true.
Who did you guys pay to get 2 talks?
I was. Wait, how come I didn't get paid for this? No, Brett told me that I was supposed to do a technical talk, and I'm not great at talks, so this is going to be kind of clumsy. And Brett had such a great slideshow that I just decided I couldn't live up to it, and so I did it in PowerPoint Paint. I hope that's okay. This is the Brandfolder official logo. I was going to give you the whole spiel. No, I looked at it. Are you serious?
It's up in the Favicon.
Yeah.
Favicon?
Home.brandfolder.com. Oh, shit. This is the legitimate official Brandfolder logo. If you do this. I was going to give you the whole spiel, but then I thought it'd be redundant since Brett did so well and talked about it for a decently long time. There's no reason for us to both do it. So I'll just move in to what my talk is about, which is sparse fields. That's a joke about a sparse field. Particularly, there's a lot of concepts of sparse fields, and if you've ever talked about sparse fields or you worked in like something like Elasticsearch or Lucene, or you're just talking about databases, there's a concept of sparse fields, which is when you have 10 columns and not all those columns are guaranteed to be filled out. There's the concept of sparse fields and it has performance impacts. I'm not talking about that today. Instead, I'm talking about APIs and API-driven development, specifically about what you can do to use sparse fields to your advantage when creating JSON APIs. I've been working at Brandfolder for 4 years. I've been working on APIs at large for the last 6, and I've built some bad ones, I've built some okay ones, and I built a decently good one at Brandfolder, and I like to share with you how I did it. But before I do that, I think we have to talk a little bit about why sparse fields and why JSON API. Going back to the history of the World Wide Web, back in like 2000, everyone was like happy if you even had an API. They didn't even care that it was SOAP and XML. And then 2002, some guy came out with the JSON spec, and that was great. And then eventually in 2005 to 2015, we had this explosion in the web development space. And now the guys at Glue know specifically what happens when you have a giant app that you split into 23 microservices, because that's hip. You now have 23 times n problems. And then you have APIs that are now across everywhere, and they're trying to talk to each other. And then how do you have a single front end like cohesively talk to all those APIs and then bring back the responses? And then literally Mark Zuckerberg had to get involved and develop GraphQL, which if you don't know what GraphQL is, it's a thing that literally just lets you combine a proxy API that knows how to spiderweb out to a bunch of individual microservice APIs. And it sounds like a great thing, and it is really cool if you have microservices. But what if I told you you didn't need to have microservices to have a great API? I think traditionally people end up with going down the microservices route. Oh, I should pull up, I made a slide for this. There's yeah.
It's my favorite slide.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. I have another joke, but I missed it, so I'll have to find a way to reincorporate it back. If anything, okay, I got it. Okay. If anything I say sounds wrong to you, feel free to shout out to me. I feel like we're a pretty chill crowd, and there's nothing wrong with people correcting each other. In fact, the world's greatest repository of knowledge was built on the sheer principle that nerds need to correct each other. And I think you've heard of it. It's called Wikipedia. That's a joke. So anyway, back to talking a lot. I worked at a company A, we'll call it company A, and we had a monolith. And we had all of these, we tried to do the splitting thing where we're trying to figure out, well, how do you take this app that has 200 models, a ridiculous sprawl of business logic and API endpoints that some serve HTML and some serve JSON, some serve XML, some deliver faxes. It was healthcare. They did. And make it more of like this convenient, like easy to use. How do you consolidate that all into like an actual like atomic kind of REST-like API? And we had a challenge because our business logic was so complex that our models were so huge and our technical debt was so high that when we started to use things like JBuilder or Rabble, or now we have serializers, if you've heard of like Active Model Serializer, there's a few others because that one's dying and I'll get to that in a little bit. When you actually made a serializer or found a way to serialize the concept of one of your models, you found out that you hit the API request to get one of them and it took 30 seconds just because it's crunching. Like it's too big. You find out that like a lot of the attributes weren't just like simple database lookups on the actual like row itself. They had to compute things. They had to make calls out to external services. And that's literally how we're back to like GraphQL of like, well, if you split up those services into little individual APIs, you'll now have 23 APIs that all return in like 200 milliseconds, but you got to make 23 calls to get all your data. But hey, you can do it all asynchronously and concurrently, so that's great. This is easy, no problem, right? Ask the glue guys, how's that going? I'm just saying, don't do it.
You're just supposed to make fun of them for how hard it is to explain what they do, not how they do it.
There's an individual server at like every one of your offices. Is that? No, I'm kidding. All right, I'll stop picking on you. I'm just kidding.
They're hiring too.
Oh. So anyway, like we had a similar problem, but not from like a lot of people try to split up their apps and like slim it down. In Brandfolder, as a startup, we started from nothing and built up over time, and we experienced the problem from the reverse, where we had simple models, simple relationships, simple attributes. Like the list of things you actually wanted to return in an API made logical sense, and they were isolated, and you could still get a response back in like 200 or less milliseconds if you're just making a REST API call. But then the app grew, and more like our serializers were just accounting for every single attribute that you threw onto the app. Eventually, we'd have conversations when a new feature needed to be built. Should we make a new model for this? But it seems like it's a pretty big overlap on this current model. But what if we have all of these JS front-end frameworks trying to make AJAX requests to fill in data dynamically from these endpoints? If we put it in there, we're going to slow down and bloat every single place that historically makes that API endpoint. So then you logically would say we can't slow down the existing experience. So then you end up in the next logical conclusion of, well, you just spin up a separate API endpoint that does something custom. And then all of a sudden that never ends. And you have like a public API that's half private and half things aren't documented and no one knows why. And then like life goes to shit, really, honestly. And so instead, this is where sparse fields actually comes to the rescue. Because in short, what it does is it future-proofs your API against any changes you make to models. That's it in a nutshell. Whew, that was a lot of talking. I could continue to talk a lot, but I thought I would just kind of open up a code editor and show you some real-life examples of what people do today, and then actually how you can migrate an existing API endpoint over to use, one, the JSON API spec, and two, get actual sparse fields. And actually the light bulbs kind of go off towards the end of the talk. I'm going to go pretty fast, and there's one part of coding in here that always gets me confused, and so I actually have the cheat sheet here, but we'll get to it. Here's a code editor. It has an app. It's really like your basic blog, articles, users app. If you were to make an assumption or guess about how the things relate, you would probably be right. It's not complicated. What I'm more interested in showing you is I have the server running right now. And if I go to localhost 3000 API v1 articles, this is really just the endpoint that we're looking at. It's currently a JSON endpoint. It follows not really any spec, just simple. And this is the kind of API response you would get if, in the view, you're using a framework like Rabble or JBuilder, which JBuilder ships right out of Rails since quite a while now, but back in the day, people used Rabble. If you wanted to make changes to this API, you would come in here and feel like you're actually now writing an XML schema. How nasty it gets if you've ever worked with it. It's blocks within blocks within blocks. It's very error prone. And when you need to make a change, you end up just shimmying stuff in somewhere. Worse, since a lot of this code doesn't get reused, you might have articles in like a show context, but you also might have a related like index of articles underneath the concept for a particular blog. You could have the index view delegate to the show, whatever show layout you give, kind of like a partial in Rails. But then you also have the same problem that I've literally just talked about. When you make one change, you've now affected all these other API endpoints and bloated them up when literally nobody asked you for it. So what do you do? The answer one for all of this like view sprawl issues is one, just delete the views folder. We don't need that where we're going. And you join on the hip bandwagon of serializers. If you don't know what a serializer is, it's a different concept where instead of letting the view of Rails decide how to display any given object in your database, you create what's called the serializer, which just knows how to display attributes for your model. That's it. It doesn't care about the context that it's used in. It's just a proxy between the controller and the model to output some JSON if you ask for it. What gets interesting is when you start making them dynamic, which to start, this won't be. So let's just build one. I need this real quick. rm-rf. Right. So I'm not going to build the entire app and make it all serializer. I'm going to focus on the article endpoint that we just saw that right now is completely busted because I deleted the view folder if it decides to load at all. So instead, all I did was in the gem file, you can see I'm going to use JSON API Rails. There's a few others. Active model serializers was a really good one, and that's the one we actually use in production today. And starting this talk, I went to it because I was going to use that because, of course, I knew the code and I can just copy and paste things over. Found out it's not maintained anymore. So that's good. It hasn't been since like 2018. It's in maintenance only mode. They had some sweet alternatives. One was JSON API Rails. Another one was Fast JSON API. That one's built by Netflix. And we also use that in production in our stack for a different reason. And it is fast as hell. When I mean fast as hell, I mean from a rendering perspective. If you're still trying to render 5 million things onto a single page, Godspeed to you. But compared to Rabble, JBuilder, Active Model Serialized, JSON API Rails, and Fast JSON API, that one is fast. Like it's really fast. Like it's like you're not even serializing anything. It's just fast. Yeah. And then if you're talking from Rabble, you're at like orders of magnitude because Rabble, ooh, man. So anyway, the whole way this works is you really just create a serializer folder in here. And I'm going to ask you guys to be my spell checker serializers / article serializable article. It's way harder when you're up here. And you pretty much just go over here and you copy paste a bunch of stuff, and then that's the end of that, and then you win at life. If you don't open up the source code by mistake. Seriously, I'm just going to do that because who remembers this, right? So serializable article. It follows the basic Rails convention of like if you name the files right, and you name the class right, and you have the order structure correctly, everything just magically works. And I'll show this in a quick second. If you wanted to look at our schema that we're working with here, an article has a title and a body. It also has a user who is the author and a blog ID. So really all you do, this is probably pretty boring for some people, but you give it a list of things that it has. It's like title, body, belongs to a user. And you're pretty much just copying the same stuff that you have over at an article. If you're ever confused on how to write it, like, it can't be much more difficult than that. You can also define a specific attribute, which is like attribute custom thing. And you can just say, this is custom. I'm gonna come back to that in a second. Now in our API, which we've of course versioned because we're smart people, you would just overwrite this to say your new show action of like, you don't need those anymore. And then I think it's like render JSON API, and you pass in like article. But this will tell us real quick. Render JSON API, and that's the thing. So if we go back here, we refresh. Wow. Oh, I gotta restart because that did not reload. Like, ta-da, I didn't write any view code and I have the whole thing done. We can ship it, we can go home, that's a wrap. This still doesn't protect us though, because from the same problem, we're at like a net zero right now of benefit of where we just came from. Sure, like we don't have a view sprawl, but we haven't allowed any of the views to be different from one another. So when we still add another attribute to article, it's going to bleed into every single API endpoint all across the world. Instead, what I will do is fast forward to git stash, check out serializers. Are you serious?
Hit clean dash out.
Now we're here.
You have to check out dash. Oh, no.
Now we're here. You got to tell it you like it first, and then it'll go away. Now, check out serial. This is just me fast forwarding a time to show you that, hey, I have an actual like article serializer with more stuff in it. Where now it has blog user fast forwarding in time. Now it's got relationships and it does joins. And when you go back to this, suddenly you're getting your server killed. Great, now your API is X amount slower because you've had it include some stuff. Specifically create an updated at. What's cool about the serializers is that when you're in a specific controller, which is going to theoretically dictate the context that an article is going to be rendered in, you can control which fields you want. So you could say, like, I don't care about, and I never remember if fields is the hash. It sure is. For anything that's an article in this response, I only care about the title. And then for articles, I would like comments, because comments are cool. Now I've made this change to this one controller, and I can make it so that now you can view only the stuff you care about for an article and also get related stuff all in one API call. I could hard code this everywhere in the app, and now everywhere in the app is loading comments for every single article that gets rendered on a page. And now we're doing joins when maybe, like, if you're on the context of like the index page for a blog and you're just wanting to list articles, why would you want the comments with those there? That seems like the wrong place for that. Then if there's millions of comments, that's good for you. It's viral media, but it's going to slow your API response down. Instead, JSON API has this stuff, this config file that allows you to automatically make something. JSON API fields, default fields. That one. Not that one. And then a default, like literally you can read the docs about this, but it'll allow you to automatically, or give the power to the user or the context of whoever is initiating the request. They can include 2 query params into the string. They can literally say include comments, or they can say fields title. And if they add those attributes, that's all they're going to get back. If they remove the include, they won't get the comments with it. And it gives the power to whoever is making the request or API to opt into the things they want, including the relationships, the fields. If you had an article in the serializer, we have that attribute third party call sleep 20. Oh my God, shoot me. Like, that's a real thing that's happened to us. Like, we accidentally added an attribute that had to go out to a third-party service, hopefully that it would be responsive, and sometimes it would hang. If it hung, it caused the first call to hang until it was done, and it could come back with the things. And then you have browser timeouts, and everyone is mad. If you allow users to customize exactly the fields that they want, just title, then they're never going to get it. Notice I didn't just sleep 20 seconds. But if I add in third-party call, oh, maybe it didn't hot reload. But, oh, because I didn't, that's a server restart. And so we'll get rid of that. Oh, now I remember. There's an order of these operations. Those config files that I just changed mean that you no longer have to explicitly declare fields and comments. Because I'd hard-coded them in this controller, it wouldn't allow the params to override anything. They're just hard-coded here. Now if I do this, by default, they're going to be everything. So now we're stuck here waiting 20 seconds. That's really unfortunate. If I kill this, I think my server is going to keep that open. And I say fields, articles, and I only want title. This is probably a bad example because it's still waiting 20 seconds on that first call. I'm an idiot.
How does it affect caching now that you just kind of basically made your API have a pretty large number of potential responses for a single, like a base URI?
First off, that works now. Second off, for caching, if you are caching on these things, one, you're going to need to know the caching on by params, and there's 2 that you need to look out for, fields and include. But there's also other things like pagination. Like on any given API endpoint, if you accepted search params or anything dynamically, usually you got to cache on that stuff anyway.
So are you guys caching on common?
We don't cache anymore. What if I told you that instead of needing caching, because your API was slow, you could just not make your API slow? This is the answer to slow APIs. It's not the end-all be-all answer of, will I ever need caching? Probably. In fact, you might want caching on specific endpoints within your serializer. There's no reason that you actually can't, in this long, stupid call, you actually cache this response. So if it still hits, like if somebody requests that, they're not going to have to wait 20 seconds every single time. You can do fragment caching for these attributes. You can do caching at the request level. You can put a like CloudFront or something in front of your stuff, like route everything through that if you want. Since it's just URL params, it's not a big deal. I'm going to blame Brett because he went long, but I actually had a whole other spiel where there's really cool things you can do once you start to dig into this that allow you to, one, eager load those associations. Because you're basically building API that says, hey, user, tell me what you want in the context, and you can build documentation around which things are optional, which things they'll get by default, and what extra things they can ask for. When you start to have a DSL like that in your REST API, you're actually very easily able to compute which things you should eager load so that when it comes time to actually render, the serializer isn't doing n+1 queries. This is what we do in Brandfolder today, where if you include some of these asset counts, we know we're going to want assets. Like, we have a mapping to that. And it's not like an ugly bit of code. And I'll send out like this repo with its finish. It's 50 lines. Like, it's one concern, and it's 50 lines, and it does it. Likewise, on those includes, you can have it actually nest down into related objects. So you can actually set up default API fields at both, in this case, the first class citizen, which is like articles. But if you included comments, you can also have sparse fields on the includes that come back from them. Because if you didn't, what if comments had another third-party thing that was like, what's your approval rating on this comment from a third-party resource? Now you have to make a 20-second API call for every comment that comes back. That would suck. So, it's a question. Okay. So I would love to show you more of that. If people want to stay, I can. Otherwise, I'll just kind of wrap it up with the proving it that it works. Is that at Brandfolder, we implemented this about 1.5 to 2 years ago. Since then, we've never had a conversation about should we include this in the API, other than if it was just a pure product thing. We've never thought, what's the technical impact of adding this thing to the API? We've never had to question the technical impact of adding, like making a migration to an existing table. We've never had to like worry about it. Our API charts, like response times on New Relic, have been mostly flat for the past 2 years, like a consistent flat. There are the edge case endpoints where when you need the context, you can request for it. But the user who signed up for the specific feature in our app that's going to make that request knows that. Like upfront, they knew that. As we add more things, they're never getting more than they bargained for, and we never have to take things away from them either. This is how you can do additive, non-breaking changes without ever changing your contract on response times to your API. One last note. This is V1 in this example of like this app. This is V1 because whatever, I spun up a new app. In production, this is V4 for us. V3 uses the exact same serializers without sparse fields. 2 to 4 weeks ago, I randomly saw a blip of a user getting a timeout because they went to a page that had never been hit in a very long time, and the browser kept timing out. It was hitting the V3 endpoint, which was just loading the whole thing. Like, there's user permission checks on certain attributes. There's dynamic calculations for asset counts. They got the whole thing, and it took 60-some seconds to load. But it's the same endpoint with literally changing V3 to V4, and it has 50 extra lines of code. That's the only difference between the two APIs. And those things render in 180 milliseconds flat, always, bar none. Any questions?
Is it easy to publish a JSON schema from your API?
When you say publish, you mean like publish as in like document it? It's really...
It's a baited question because we've had some similar problems.
Mm-hmm.
We used the GraphQL, RubyGem, and our front-end React guys were complaining that our API was so fast. Like literally, New Relic was saying that our average response times were between 50 and 70 milliseconds. So they had to put in stuff in their front-end code so that the user knew that something changed.
Right. Yeah. Isn't that the dream? Sounds like a first world problem.
And we were like, we can slow it down, but I just
Sleep 10. That'll do it. No, so like, is it easy to document the changes? I guess there's 2 parts to your question. One, we only document, since we set up defaults for every single model. Like if you requested nothing, if you just hit articles with no includer fields, we set up healthy defaults. In Brandfolder, you would get the ID, the name, tagline, privacy, slug. These are things, and like obviously you get a 404 or 403 depending on your authorization on it, if you could know about it or not. But these are what you get by default. And then we don't try to document what it looks like when you do all these includes and these fields. Because one, you have to opt into them. So you're going to figure out exactly what you get because you literally typed it in. And two, we follow all of these serializers will give you everything in the exact same structure, bar none, in JSON API format. So if you ever want to like be able to programmatically crawl API responses and never have to think about it, this takes away that nasty view logic of like, well, since I now check this out, who knows between the article show and the other one that had like, I don't know, I had another one here of like, who knows the difference between the structure of those two API endpoints. So for documenting it, it's very easy. You can't mess it up. You'll never do something custom. So it takes that whole problem away.
Are there any benefits to using this serializer over fast JSON? Or is it just mainly for like research purposes? I've only ever used fast JSON, so I'm curious about the other ones. And
so I've now built this exact feature twice in 2 different serializers. I've also used fast JSON API for a different purpose where I didn't build it. They all are like 92 to 5% exactly the same as far as their APIs and what you can do with it. The actual code that you would have to write, oh God, here we go. Get add period, get reset head dash dash hard. Oh God, I spelled it wrong. Get status, are we okay? Okay, get check out. Get check out super sparse fields. I actually had 2 more levels to where I would add this in, but just to go check out the code of what all this looks like. In your controller, there's one concern. No, actually, I just put it in the application controller because I'm a maniac. 3 private methods that all it does, they're responsible for parsing the 2 params, fields and includes, and turning them into combinations of what this API expects the format to be in, include being an array and this doing that, and injecting defaults for every class that you requested. But it's easy to do because if you've already been given the specific like literally model names in your API response, like you can easily do this. It's not that complicated. It's just kind of a brain teaser of you're like turning arrays into hashes and then hashes of arrays and things like that. But once you have it set up, like I haven't touched this in 20 months in production. It just works. It works with polymorphic associations. It works for alias associations. It works for custom associations. It works for single table inheritance if you've got that. Like we solved it all. And with sparse fields, we were able to just have, hopefully, truly, the end all be all, like v4 is our final API, unless we're going back to SOAP, in which case, v-1. I think we're at time. I want to be respectful of that. Any last questions?
There's no hard time if people don't have to leave it or they do it.
Okay.
So if you want to encourage you to keep going, if you want to, that's fine. I think this is interesting. So I would say so. But
Yeah.
because
So I can still delete that. Go ahead.
So is it just mainly specifically for this serializer they have to preload the associations? Or is it?
No.
I don't think I've ever had to do that in fast JSON, but I don't know if I've ever had to.
You don't have to do it in any of them. What I found is if you start tailing the logs here, as you start doing stuff, you start to notice a bunch of this, which means to me like n+1 queries.
Gotcha.
And if you can get it so that it does the preloading, you'll actually just only have 2 lines there, regardless of how many comments and like child comments have to get rendered. And that was the solution that we were trying to solve with at Brandfolder of like, now that we went down this path and now we know sparse fields, but somebody does include all this stuff, how do we make that fast? There's this iterative approach where you can turn just one API endpoint, like all of the gems, Rabble, JBuilder, I think active model serializers, and the other one are all included at the same time in this app, and they don't conflict with each other. They all have almost the exact same DSL, but they're namespaced in ways that you'll never accidentally render or choose the wrong one unless you didn't dynamically call for it in the controller. And so as you change one endpoint, and then you start making things sparse. You've solved that problem. Now it's, okay, well, what happens if for the endpoints that people do want? And it's like, well, since you've already done the work to make it sparse, you already have the exact mapping of the associations in your app they're going to call for. There's a sweet prefetch command that you can just pull it in. I don't even know if I have it in here, but it's like, usually when you're making a query in Active Record, you do a dot includes and you pass in like the array of things that you want to include, or like a nested hash of like if there's child relationships there. Technically, you just spent this entire first part of sparse fields creating that hash anyway, and you just throw this to like in the controller, or you can have it literally as part of your serializer optimizer concern that dynamically does it for you and never blinks twice. That would probably take a little bit longer for me to code out, but I know it works.
Last one, have there been any downside or like crazy side effects from using a serializer like this? For anyone? Random things you might have ran into that was just like, I have no idea what the fuck this game is.
Active model serializers has really weird documentation where a lot of things are hidden and you have to go into the source code, but then it kind of makes sense when you find out all the core contributors have left, and it tells you literally not to use it. So I had already started using it. I'm not going to just turn it off in production, but if I ever made a V5, I would probably actually go to this one I just did, or I would use fast.json API together. Other than like documentation and just uncovering the secrets, I've never been burned by it.
What's the default Rails one now?
It's JBuilder, which is mildly better than Rabble. And when you start I mean, people are going to throw pagination on stuff, so it's not the end of the world. But if you try to have it like, it seriously starts to bog down as it approaches like 1,000 to 5,000, 10,000 things. Like if it has to serialize that many things, it just slows down. Yeah.
I can give you an example of where it falls apart. So we use GraphQL, and this is kind of like GraphQL Lite in that like this is allowing you to customize what data you're getting back. So the downside you avoid is people were just getting all the data when they only need 2 fields, which means you're going to see your performance problems right away. What we've seen is the opposite. Because our API is completely customizable, we can never anticipate the weird like combination edge cases where like, things can be really slow.
Yeah, I guess it's also like if you got that problem, like kind of also congrats. Like you're too fast, and like you're too fast except for that time you're not. That like is kind of now an edge case.
We're never fast.
Touche.
It's binary. It's time out.
It goes back to that one. It goes back to that one API endpoint that we accidentally leaked in, and we're like, it stopped using the sparse fields, and now it takes 65 seconds. Like, ouch.
Is there any budgeting in JSON API? Because that's one way you solve it in GraphQL is you say, hey, this field is 5 points, this one is 10, and you get up to 100 points per query.
Your max complexity.
Yeah.
Are you guys using the GraphQL region? Or?
Yeah. So there's not with this where it's like you can. We use our V4 API 100% like our app is powered by it. It's also public. We have many customers using it as well, but our entire app, entire monolith is powered by itself using the V4 API. And so on one hand, we are the best custodians to know of like what we're doing in that context of like, I can go check if this is going to be expensive or not. I can also just test the API call and see if it is. If at the base level of like, we're talking about essentially GraphQL at the actual API level, like GraphQL is really awesome because one, you can do sparse fields, but if you're technically, if it's pointing at like, this is where the username and I go here to get that endpoint and that endpoint doesn't respect sparse fields, that's technically still going to crunch the entire user query and everything associated with it. Like you're still bottlenecked at whichever call it makes is the slowest. It'll do them all concurrently and you can provide weights to them, and that's great. But if even just that user API endpoint did it use sparse fields and then you taught GraphQL how to send it sparse fields, now you're not bottlenecked by it anymore. So if you have to use, I'm not going to like shit on microservices and say that you shouldn't do it. I think there's like very, very valuable. It just depends on why you're splitting things up. And if you can find a way to use sparse fields on all of them, like the world is your oyster. Like you can do almost anything you want, and waits become kind of meaningless because everything is really fast. Great. Well, thank you, everybody. I'm gonna show you